thank you for a wonderful and detailed and wide-ranging talk. Let's open it up to questions. Let's take questions for about 20-25 minutes, and then there's tea and snacks served outside. Let's start there, and then start with
Thank you. That was a very interesting and elaborate presentation. I just want to raise two ways perhaps you can extend this conversation a little bit more in terms of ethics and craftsmanship and its relationship to some of the concerns you have already raised. One that concerns to me as a reader who is increasingly not reading the newspapers is this journalism of binaries and oversimplification. The tendency to represent stories in ways that necessarily distort them without perhaps meaning to or intending. So what is that say about our craftsmanship, training, and skill development among the journalists? So because we are an institution that has some interest in pedagogies and what have you, so I'm asking that. The other is the overemphasis on fact, which is necessary, I understand that, over imagination. So increasingly I see little and little in traditional journalism, the journalism of imagination. Here I am not necessarily making a case for permissiveness, which is present, but the kind of a stylistic journalism of long story forms that we used to read growing up is getting marginalized. So that is the other. So what are the kind of, you have been the journalist, what is coming out of our journalism schools in terms of ethics and the craftsmanship and the skills?
Okay, let's take them in a group. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful talk. My question is that are you not, or are we all not holding on to a very ideal vision of what civil society media has to be? Perhaps we are moving through a phase where the media's function of accountability, etc., is expected, but media also saw itself as participating in creating a critical consciousness and a debate. And what it forgets or takes and arrogates itself a position that it can talk from to the reader. And what we might have been noticing worldwide, not only in media and politics as well, is that a rejection of that way of talking to people and a mode of communication. So people might be, they don't want to be told that what is good. Rather, they have their own ideas, we might not agree with it. And that might be leading to a new kind of a situation where people can pull their own ideas, facts, etc., and construct their own narratives. And this media as part of the narrating the nation, that perhaps is collapsing worldwide. And we haven't got a new way of addressing it. So people themselves might not be wanting to what you want to tell them. They might be wanting to know that I have my leader. I want a particular worldview. I already have formed my worldview, and I want that to be validated every day. And I say this because we ourselves practice that. When I go open my Facebook, the Facebook wall has people sharing news items and commenting, which are all of same kind, because my friends are of my same kind. So it's the people like us everywhere. And we are trying to converse, and we somehow arrogate ourselves in higher positions that we know what is to be done and others are not understanding us. So whether there is a particular social change through which we are going through.
Yeah, clearly enunciated the problems. If you were to give 2 or 3 remedies, specifically with respect to political economy, what would you handle?
I have 2 questions. So the first question, like we saw in USA during the Bush presidency, there was a lot of controlled propaganda where the media was given like specific news that they would then to broadcast to the public. And this was seen as like propaganda because it obviously was in a sense. And if the freedom of information was restricted. So can't we say that the Modi regime is carrying out similar propaganda through social media? For example, when Sushma Swaraj is on Twitter and she's helping out all these various people who are in need, although that can be seen as a good, is like something which is something good and something she's just doing for the benefit of the people, but it can also be seen as propaganda. So can we see that they're adopting the same strategy? And my second question was regarding the Official Secrets Act that you talked about. So now we can see that the Official Secret is gaining a lot of prominence in recent times, especially as of July. I think it's also being worked into the Whistleblower Protection Amendment. So can't you say that implication of OSA into all these various mechanisms such as RTI and whistleblower protection, isn't it defeating the very purpose that is combat espionage? And isn't it just moving towards helping reduce dissent amongst people and workers within the government in case of the whistleblower protection?
Should I answer this? Fine, I'll quickly run through them.
The question on what the prevailing kind of journalism tells us about training and pedagogy. I think all the journalists that I've encountered, maybe in my time at the Hindu and at the Wire, of course, we're not really hiring large numbers at all. It's more of a shoestring operation. But at the Hindu, in 3 years, I think must have hired at least 30, 35 journalists primarily from ACJ, but from a couple of other J schools also. And I've interacted with people in different media organizations, and I often visit. I was at the Indian School of Journalism and New Media in Bangalore the other day for their convocation. I can't fault at all the kind of training they get. I think every journalism school, or at least the better ones, devote ample time to the ethical issues. Most of the journalists who come out with have very heightened sensibilities about the importance of journalism, what it means in a society like ours, the importance of being objective, factual, truth-telling, having empathy, learning to listen. And they virtually all come out of J school expecting that they would be able to change the world, right? And that the ethics that they are taught will be an integral part of that process of changing the world. They then join news organizations where, for a variety of reasons, but news organizations are also very hierarchical, right? So typically the first job you will get will be on the desk, or maybe a beat as a beat reporter, where it's not the most exciting beat, or it's a far cry from what you imagine you'd be doing. And even then, I would say it's not as if at that level journalists are called upon to make any ethical compromises. It's very, in the sense that if you're in your first reporting job and you're doing the sanitation beat, or you're doing the Swachh Bharat beat, or something like that, it's not as if you will be called upon either by your editor or proprietor or somebody to kill a story because it shows a corporator in bad light. It doesn't happen like that, right? So I think most journalists rise to the ranks with their ethical compass intact. Yeah.
I just clarify so
Yeah.
that I get the answer that perhaps I wanted. This is a normative issues that you're dealing, and I have no question that most of them socialize through these processes with good set of norms that they
Yeah.
look out for. My question was more to do with the craftsmanship and its relationship to ethics. In the sense, if you are not skilled to write a story as
Yeah.
complex
Yeah.
as it
Okay,
appears to you,
I get it.
you end up oversimplifying
No, fair
it, you do injustice.
No, see there, again, I'm going to fault the pedagogy.
Because if you look at the stories, and I've seen maybe 4 or 5 J school, they all produce magazines and newspapers and so on as a part of the curriculum. They learn the craft pretty well, right? To report something with background and context, to quote people, identify your sources where possible. If somebody emerges in a negative light from a particular story, that person must have their point of view reflected in some way. or you must make a fair attempt to get their point of view. Most of the kids who come out of J school learn this trade craft, right? But their implementation of this in the actual workplace is, always the problem. Because when you're covering the municipal beat, you're told to finish your story in 300 words, right? So you barely have enough space to recount the basic facts, and there's no space for you to get quotes, response, perspective. And if this is true for the city level stories, the same is 10 times more true for foreign policy, it's very, very rare in the Times of India or Hindustan Times, which confines its reporters to 300 words, to have that kind of background, context and perspective. At the Hindu, when I was there, and even before I was there, we always tried to give reporters more space. But, and they would always, reporters would always be told, even in Times of India, they're told that, look, you can always write a longer copy for the web. But things don't quite work in that way. You're essentially doing one copy to make the print edition. And so there is a problem with the mechanics of the functioning of media organizations, which and it's space, it's mindset also. One thing I didn't address, but which is linked to what you're saying and linked to the second part of your question, fact versus imagination. You meant it in a benign way, that there is an art and craft of storytelling, which becomes a casualty the minute you say, please finish your story in 300 words or 400 words. It also, I have to say that there is a declining standard of English in this country also. So, people's ability to write and write grammatically and, write in literary, style is also, it's come down. But the pressure that, there is pressure on many journalists to not confine their stories only to fact and to actually editorialize. And you see this most pronouncedly on TV, where particularly for channels like NewsX, Times Now, I would imagine even the soon to be launched Republic TV, the reporter is out there as a kind of, ideologue or a highly opinionated person who is reporting less, passing judgment more, putting labels on somebody, and passing judgment, the anchor passes judgment. So this melding of reporting with editorializing, to my mind, is the bane of Indian journalism. So I would very much like there to be space for, what you call the journalism of the imagination, by which you mean something very different from the move away from factual reporting, which has gone in a toxic direction in this country. Are we holding on to an ideal form of what civil society? There are two parts to what I think you're saying, which is that the fact is that today the most successful channels in India are those that are talking down to the viewer, actually, that are giving highly opinionated, that are telling them what the nation wants to know. Right? So I wouldn't say that people are tired of being told what to do because they are backing those particular channels. But the second part of what you said is perhaps the answer to this phenomenon, which is that, the phrase that we use of, people in their own, what are the bubbles, the ivory towers or the, thought bubbles, you basically want revalidation of your own beliefs and prejudices. Perhaps it's always been that way. I can't imagine that the 21st century Indian is more inclined to have her views validated through the news than she was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Maybe she is. Maybe it's something about the method, the fast-paced nature of communication, or maybe the increasingly brittle nature of public discourse that has made her so. But I would say that this is a problem to the extent to which people shut off. But this is then a challenge for journalism. So I think that finding ways to tell stories where you present facts in a way that they cannot be dismissed as your prejudice or your opinion, where you anticipate questions that the average reader or viewer may have. I would say that is what smart journalism is all about. that if you want to cover, you want to write about the what Bilkis Bano's conviction tells us, what Bilkis Bano's case tells us about the culpability in some sense of Narendra Modi. If you want to write about that, be upfront about the fact that there was an SIT and the SIT gave him a so-called clean chit, right? So don't leave it to the reader to say, aha, you're writing all this but you're not mentioning the SIT. So I did a piece last night where para 3, I say he got his SIT and he got his clean chit. And it's only the High Court or the Supreme Court that can take it away from him. So let's give that, right? But is there some sense in which the unfolding of this case tells us a little bit about the place of the role of the Gujarat government in ensuring justice? So yes, we can't ever prove that Narasimha Rao, Rajiv Gandhi or Narendra Modi gave the order कि भाई उसको मारो. You'll never be able to prove that, and maybe that's not the way these things happen in any case, right? But can I infer something from the fact that the CBI of Atal Bihari Vajpayee tells the Supreme Court that Mr. Modi's police actively ensured that Bilkis Bano did not get justice, right? So fine, if he didn't know what was happening and this is happening anyway, ठीक है. So you can say, at worst you can say he wasn't a great administrator. I mean, even that the Bhakts contest, right? But let's say that he was a new CM and, or Rajiv Gandhi was a new PM, he didn't know, so let's give him the benefit of doubt. But then why do you spend the next 2-3 years ensuring that FIRs are not registered, ensuring that cases are sabotaged, ensuring that witnesses are intimidated? And what does that tell you about, so I think presenting facts in a narrative in that way would be one way to address this. But otherwise, I fully agree with you. It is oppressive, and in a way we always seek validation. And maybe all our reading habits should be such that we are openly inviting, opening our eyes to what the other side is saying. It's important. The question of remedies, sir, political economy remedies, legal remedies. I would say, legal, I had really hoped that the Supreme Court would see the sense and wisdom of the challenge to criminal defamation. And I still hope that a larger bench will revisit this, because if you go through the judgment and the way the judgment is structured, the bench took on board all the objections that were raised, but it did not address the issue that many of the petitioners raised, that if other democracies can do away with criminal defamation, why is it that India can't? And if that is the case, what are the other remedies? So I think that there was recently an argument made by Rakesh Shukla, who said that, okay, fine, maybe the court has upheld criminal defamation, but we should encourage it to revisit and make the argument that allow criminal defamation only when the defamatory speech, the criminally defamatory speech, is likely to lead to the commission of an offense or the incitement of violence. So, if I said that, let us assume for a minute that the Hindu was engaged in an act of criminal defamation when it carried Karunanidhi's press conference saying that Jayalalitha is an inefficient chief minister, right? Let's accept that this was criminally defamatory, but does it lead to the incitement of violence? And can the Supreme Court not say that, okay, let us have this as a benchmark in order for us to criminalize speech? So that could be one way to deal with this. OSA, I think there needs to be a debate, and I'm addressing your question now, that the purpose of the OSA, the only possible purpose of a law like the OSA in a country like ours, in a democracy, is to provide legal armory, a legal leg to tackle espionage cases. But the way the OSA is worded is a colonial era act that had to do with a time when the rulers wanted to hoard information, when information was vital for protecting this oppressive colonial state. And nobody can argue today that this is the role that the Indian state should aspire to. So if that's not the role the Indian state should aspire to, why should it seek the protection of those kinds of laws? The OSA is worded so liberally, so broadly, that the possession of any document that is not meant to be, that is not officially cleared for dissemination, could well, make you fall foul of the OSA and have somebody say that you're committing espionage. It's absolutely, every journalist always gets documents of some kind or the other. It may be a draft government proposal, it may be talking points for diplomatic negotiations, it may be, when I covered the nuclear deal for the Hindu, I often came across non-papers, I often came across some of the notes that, when there were disagreements between government departments, technically all of that could, would come under OSA. And it's then up to the government to then decide when they've had enough of you, and when they say, chalo, isko khatam karo, OSA lagao, and then you're stuck fighting, next 10 years. The most ridiculous application of OSA was against my colleague and friend Iftikhar Gilani, who was bureau chief of Kashmir Times during the NDA-1 government. And he happens to be son-in-law of the Hurriyat leader, Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani. And in order to get even against Sayyid Ali Shah Gilani, I forget what was happening, why that government at that time wanted to go after Gilani, Bade Gilani, they decided to fix the son-in-law also. So they raided his house and of course found nothing other than on his computer a soft copy of a document that was entitled Troop Deployments in Jammu and Kashmir. That was a document that he had downloaded from a Pakistani website, that in turn the Pakistani website had got from the IDSA, which is a Ministry of Defense funded think tank. And this document had absolutely no security or strategic value. Yet the presence of that document on Iftikhar Gilani's computer was enough for them to slap OSA on him. And he was sent to Tihar jail. OSA is such a draconian law, and the fear of espionage and national security is such that no lower judge is willing to go against the government. So if at all you have a chance of getting bail, you have to go to High Court. So the fact that the OSA is being connected to whistleblowers, the fact that you want to have a carve out in the RTI is very, very dangerous. And I would say, I didn't address RTI in my talk, but I would say that the legal, if we're looking at the legal kind of architecture which enables or disables journalists from pursuing their job, the RTI was a great asset and is a great asset, but today is being undermined not just by the deliberate violation of its provisions or the obfuscation of requests by different government departments. So it's kind of routine practice now that your first request is simply tossed into. It's like an insurance company, right? Any of you who ever dealt with insurance companies, your first letter is always thrown into the bin. And the reason insurance companies do this is because they say even if 10% people get discouraged, then that's 10% that we save. So let's wait, don't address an insurance claim until you get the second request. So this is now the status of RTI. Your first request is thrown away. You have to appeal. Then you get a response if you're lucky. So I think that this is a problem, and we need to push in terms of legal remedies for fight against the proposed dilution of the RTI that the government is trying to do via amendments of the rules. We need to fight against the dilution of the Whistleblowers Act. We need to demand modification, if not altogether the withdrawal of the Official Secrets Act, and of criminal defamation. In terms of the political economy remedies, that's where we enter interesting territory. I think that we created an advertising line at the Hindu when I was there, where we said that because we were trying to increase the price of the Hindu to one where we would be less dependent in different territories on advertising revenue, which we weren't getting, right? So the Hindu in Delhi, which is an important niche paper, it's the third largest selling paper in Delhi. I helped to increase the price to 8 rupees at a time when the Times of India and HT were 3 or 4. And the view we took was that, look, and we got some reader complaints, and we said, look, if you don't pay for the news that you read, then somebody else is going to be paying for it. And that's where paid news comes into the equation. So that's the way we try to appeal to readers. And I think the future success of the Indian media in terms of business strategy and in terms of having a business model that would help you preserve your ethical and preserve the ethical basis of journalism would be to throw oneself at the mercy of readers and viewers. to say that, look, you are the guys for whom we are producing this content. You are the readers and viewers to whom we, whom we are serving up our content. And if you want good journalism, if you want journalism that speaks truth to power, if you want journalism that is investigative, if you want journalism that covers stories that are dear and important to you, then be prepared to pay for it. And we're not saying that you have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars, but at least a realistic price for the news that you consume, which then enables organizations to pay for this. Now, I don't see the large media organizations going down that route, but I think for people like us, like The Wire, we deliberately chose to be a not-for-profit because we wanted to remove from the mind of the reader any sense that money that she or he donates will somehow go to line our pockets, right? Because there is a perception that journalists are crooks, editors are corrupt, media proprietors are swindlers and embezzlers. So we say, let's take that off the table completely, because this is a not-for-profit company. Any money that is ever made, and we hope that days come someday, that money will be made and redeployed, will be redeployed, cannot go into any private profit of the owners. Second reason we wanted to be not-for-profit is because every investor gets into the business because he or she wants to dictate, or he or she wants to make money. And you can't make money. They all have their own ideas of what it takes to make money. And certainly the investor is the first point of vulnerability when media is being critical, when media is being objective and independent and fierce. It's the first point of vulnerability that a hostile government or a hostile bureaucracy will find. How did the Vajpayee government undermine Tehelka? It undermined Tehelka by ordering income tax and ED raids on the owners of Tehelka. And eventually, despite the courage that the Sharmas showed, Tehelka had to shut shop. So we wanted to avoid that vulnerability by saying our business model will be one where we don't have investors who can be suborned or browbeaten or leaned upon by the government. We will rely on no strings attached donations. We will rely on the philanthropy of concerned citizens. We will rely on the goodwill of readers. And I think that what we've done so far and what we are fairly confident of accomplishing suggests that there is space for this kind of business model to succeed. I do feel that unless the bulk of the media also come up with some plans, the future of commercial media looks increasingly bleak. Because I simply do not see, in an era where eventually the bulk of Indian readers migrate online and print circulation falls to the extent to which it's fallen, say, in North America or Europe, I do not see online advertising generating the kind of revenue that large news gathering organizations like the Times of India or the Hindustan Times have. I don't see online advertising sustaining large news gathering organizations. The New York Times is a good example of a paper which has a successful website. The website not only breaks even, it makes money, right? So it's a profit center for the NYT. But tomorrow, if print were to collapse completely, I can't imagine that the internet advertising earnings of NYT.com would be enough to pay for all the bureaus and all the reports and all the money that the New York Times spends in order to produce the kind of high quality journalism that it does.
What is the production cost of Hindu newspaper?
The physical paper would be, I would say probably about the Hindu in Delhi, 8 to 10 rupees.
No, I'm talking about production cost, putting everything together, so that how much you get from your reader and how much.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That if we think of the paper as being one copy, right?
Okay.
Right? So the marginal cost, those of you who are doing economics here, the marginal cost of each copy is around, let's say, 12 rupees. The marginal revenue from each copy is, well, in the case of the Hindu in Delhi, it sells for 10. The vendor will probably keep about 2. And maybe wholesaler, so the Hindu would probably get 7 rupees. So that's the best, marginal revenue. To have a negative marginal profit of just minus 3 is probably the best in the industry for the Hindu in Delhi. The Times of India's marginal cost would be probably 18 rupees because they produce a thick paper. And the marginal revenue would be maybe 1. because they sell it for 3 or 350. They have these annual schemes, like where you pay maybe 1,000 rupees for the whole year and you get Times and Navbharat Times or Times and ET. So the I would say marginal revenue is close to zero. And so then you are getting the bulk of your revenue then from advertising, right? So I can tell you that the macro picture, a company like, a paper like Times of India, 90 to 95% of its revenue would come from advertising revenue, and only 2 or 3% would come from the cover price. In terms of the big picture, the Hindu, this data is also interesting. The Hindus, in the year that I left, the total ad revenue from the print side was probably around 700 to 800 crore. The total revenue from the internet side was around 4 or 5 crore. So, and the Times of India, by comparison, it's had a annual profit, right? So the Hindu's top line was about 800 crore, on which it earned a profit of about 60 or 70 crore per annum. That's it. The Times of India's top line was 1,000 crore. Sorry, Times of India's bottom line. They made 1,000 crore on a top line of maybe 2,000 or 2,500 crore. And most of that was advertising, or in the case of Times of India, they've signed what are called private treaties. So in exchange for advertising and coverage, they would acquire small stakes in a whole range of industries, and then would find ways to monetize that. So that's also become an increasingly important part of the revenue stream of Times of India. And in the case of HT, the actual investments made in different portfolios has become a major source of revenue for them.
You talked about the media business model being one where there would be more investment in businesses on the side than in the media itself. But within media organizations, is there a fundamental restructuring in terms of how strong are the editorial departments? For instance, in publishing, the marketing has grown and the editorial has become much smaller. So, because we have had editors being eased out, of course, Arnab Goswami's story would be different from Rajdeep Sardesai. So one would have political dimensions, another would have different kind of dimensions. So what's happening within media organizations themselves, outside of the model? Two is that George Orwell in his 1984 novel said, what was expected of the population every day was 2 minutes of hate. You look at this screen and you scream at your enemies. So I've certainly been missing my 2 hours of hate for the past couple of months, but there's a muscular majoritarianism that's sweeping across the world. So the crisis of credibility of the media, of the academia, of politics, of many institutions, in fact, would you say that every institution has to rebuild itself? Or do you think it's a deeper ideological crisis of the left and the liberal and a certain kind of opinion? Because today, supposing someone were to write a very robust story critical of Donald Trump or Narendra Modi, I guess the reader would look at the headline, try and make out, is it critical? And then the facts don't matter. The opinion is preformed, it's just coming from the regular secular press. So, so is the crisis ideological, or is it institutional?
I had a question as well, which is, if you could talk a little bit more about at the end of your talk, you kind of touched on the different alternative spaces that the media could occupy rather than just being this, rather than just the mainstream kind of subservient space. And also, if you could talk a little bit about what all is behind the making of Modi's image. What exactly goes on with that? And is the media complicit with it, or is he sidestepping it entirely? I mean, which of the two is it?
So I just want to know, apart from this, the ideology, the kind of complicity of media and projecting this image of Modi, the political economy problems, the legal problems, what are the other problems you think in substantive content that the media in India faces? I mean, in terms of what are the issues it picks up, what are the areas it was to sort of cover? Or do you think some of these anxieties about political economy squeezing space for independence and all can be addressed by occupying a different kind of space, or like sort of even looking at a different kind of story that might not have been done earlier? Maybe, I mean, I'm just mirroring certain anxieties that are generally heard about the lack of, I mean, the complete underrepresentation of the Northeast from popular media. Or this is a point you made that bureaus are not sent into like the interior regions in certain places like maybe Odisha, Jharkhand, maybe in places like Karnataka. So if some of those things would be.
I'll start in reverse order.
There are vast areas that the media has abandoned. And when we launched The Wire, actually, we sensed an opportunity in covering precisely those areas that the media was not, that the big media was not interested in covering. So if they don't want Northeast, I've actually hired somebody whose main brief is to write on the Northeast. And if you don't want labor, we do a regular coverage of labor. You don't want rural and farming, we do a lot of stuff on rural and farming. You don't want gender and sexuality in a particular kind of way, we will give you that, right? So we, and you don't want science coverage, we're giving science. Right? So whatever big media has said, कि हमको नहीं मांगता है, we are saying, चलो ठीक है, we are happy to do it. Because we think that there is a readership for it. We think that society needs this stuff. And that this is an integral part of journalism. Like, as and when our resources grow, like, you know, one of the things we decided early on was that we want to review books, and all kinds of books. It shouldn't be that it's just an Indian book or a book about India. If there's a great, you know, a Moroccan novelist whose book everybody's talking about in the world, I want that review in the Wire, right? So gradually we've moved to a situation where we're pretty much reviewing 4 books a week, and we'll step up. We'll end up, you know, maybe in a year's time, doing 1 book review a day, which is more than all the other, you know, big media combined, if at all they even do books. The shift away from covering these things has been long in the making. It predates the Modi era, predates even Manmohan Singh, and is really a product of the idea that, you know, of this advertiser-driven media, that you don't, that there's no space because you're devoting so much of space to physical space to advertising. The advertiser is sensitive to the kind of themes or subjects that sit next to his or her advertisement. I was once told in the Times of India that you know, why you want to have a story on poverty and farmer suicides on page 1 when we are going to be having this housing society ad and this big new complexes coming up, that builder won't like it to have you know, his ad juxtaposed next to. So this is the kind of crass thinking that the marketing departments and the advertising guys bring to the table. And to answer your question, Albina, it is this section that has you know, grown in influence, but over a long period, over I would say over a 2-decade long period. But I would say perish the thought that there was ever some golden era of Indian journalism either, in the sense that yes, in the 70s, advertising and marketing departments were not that dominant, but it's not as if the journalism of that era was all that feisty or hard-hitting, or you know, it's not as if there was great interest in covering labor or great interest in covering, you know, otherwise we wouldn't have been in the bad state that we're in if we had that kind of media. So I think that the changes on the political economy side have made things worse, but it's not as if the trend earlier, that there was some benign, it's not that the license permit Raj era allowed, you know, gave India better or more vibrant journalism. So I think that, you know, these are, you know, the business model in a way, you know, if you're cutting costs, if you have shrinking ad revenue, then you say, why should I spend money on, and you know, all these guys do their surveys and say, well, okay, only a small fraction of my readers are really interested in the high arts or in an art review or dance review. So why should I spend any money doing that? Mr. Samir Jain, the reason, you know, I once asked him, why are there no book reviews in the Times of India? So he says that let the publishers advertise. Why should I give them free advertising? So that's his point of view, that this review is really just promotion of the book. He's obviously never heard of a critical book review, but anyway, that's a separate issue. So I think that this is one thing that it is possible to address. Your second question is like a big question which I'm not going to answer because I'm not sure of my having thought through this deeply. But I would say that your instincts are correct. This is a larger issue here. Is it ideological? Is it political? Is it I would say my kind of 2 cents worth that whether we speak of the victory of Donald Trump or the rise of Bernie Sanders in the campaign or the Brexit vote or the kind of bizarre contest you're seeing in France or the victory, slightly shady, of Mr. Erdogan in Turkey or the rise of Mr. Narendra Modi and the appeal of somebody like Adityanath, it does reflect the crisis of institutions of, for want of a better term, modern liberal capitalist, the modern liberal capitalist order. People see, these institutions have not worked to deliver results for the mass of people. And I think that this failure in most countries has opened space for the left, it's opened space for the right. And, it's a different matter that in India, the left does not seem to be in a position to take advantage of the disenchantment with. So you can have a guy like Modi, whose election, and your question of the image, whose election centered around crores and crores of rupees being spent on image building, on the media, kind of on very slick media campaigns, on the use of social media that was all very, very well funded, highly gamed kind of strategies for which serious money was spent. So you can have this gentleman present himself as somebody who's against the big guys, who's against crony capitalism, who took every foreign trip he takes, he has Mr. Adani with him. Yet he talks against crony capitalism, and he's seen as somebody who's against corruption and black money. So this is so he's responding to people's disenchantment with the way things have worked. But in the absence of somebody else presenting, going out there and actually fighting for a different kind of vision, this allows all of these elements to prosper. I would say that this one point I didn't mention because of the comparison. I began with this: how are we different from? How are we similar to the emergency? And I said that essentially we are quite different. One way in which we are, that we should remember we are different, is that the international climate today is far more supportive of, or will be far less critical of leaders and governments who are restricting rights, leaders and governments who are clamping down on their people. There is a culture of permissiveness around the world that did not exist in the 70s. And I think that this is another factor that we need to take on board in considering what kind of alternatives, what kind of strategy that you will have. Somewhere down the line, I can't, when we try to make a one-to-one correspondence between the state of the media and capitalism or corporate ownership, this doesn't work for the simple reason that corporate ownership, capitalism, market-driven economics is what underpins the mass media in the United States. But if you compare the way the mass media has responded to, dominant sections of the mass media have responded to the election of Trump and the kind of challenges that this has thrown before journalism, and you compare that to what's happening in India, you then realize that it's not just a question of corporate or capital or market. There's something to do with the robustness of institutions. There's something to do with, I would say, but this may be an unpopular thing to say in a country that takes pride in being the largest democracy, it has something to do with the robustness of even our commitment to democracy and the kind of deep roots that democracy has yet to strike in this country compared to the United States, where they've had now, at least 50 years of universal, they've had a shorter period of universal adult franchise in the US compared to India. But somehow democracy has struck deeper roots. Institutions of governance are more independent and less amenable to manipulation and control and being manipulated than in this country. I think that this is why the US may also weather some of the challenges that they are confronting in a far easier manner than what we are going to be facing here. You mentioned you wanted the issue of alternatives. I mean, I think that one of the advantages of our era, the age of Modi, is that there's a huge expansion in the internet access, smartphones. I mean, not because of Mr. Modi, but this is the nature of the times we're in. And what this has done is that it's created a number of problems for the public sphere as well. Lack of civility, anonymity breeds foul behavior, misogynist attitudes have become quite commonplace in social media, have become acceptable even. But it's also created an opportunity for democratic-minded people to, at fairly low cost, use these methods of reach, communication, dissemination to target or to have an alternative point of view reach millions and millions of people in a way that this was not possible 20 years ago. So if you wanted to challenge the censorship of the emergency, you had to resort to a cyclostyle machine, producing leaflets that you would then distribute in a clandestine way, or maybe the censors didn't bother about small magazines, so you could get away with things. But that was maybe you're reaching 2,000 people. Today, it's very hard for governments to censor the internet. They can do so in limited areas, like they're doing in Jammu and Kashmir, for example, where they've shut off access to all social media for indefinitely. Absolutely, quite unacceptable kind of restriction. But even there, clever people know how to get around it using VPNs.
Turkey, they banned Wikipedia.
Yeah, exactly. Turkey's banned Wikipedia. Pakistan banned YouTube. Governments try all this, but so this affects the mass nature. But there are enough people who have means of communicating who can. So repressive governments can slow down dissemination, but you can't prevent it entirely. And I think that for an organization like ours, which is seeking to validate the importance of our trade craft and professionalism and professional journalism, and doing so using the internet, new technology, and a new business model, I would say that this simply wouldn't have been possible even 10 or 15 years ago. Today, a story that we run has as much chance of reaching millions of people through going viral as a story in a large media platform. So the fact that you have there are virtually no entry barriers, and potentially unlimited horizontal reach, provided you manage to become the subject of enough conversations. That is something which has created space for an alternative to emerge and to flourish. And what it needs is a critical mass of people and a large enough ecosystem of people engaging with media in this way to actually make a difference in the way in which news is generated, covered, and disseminated.
Okay, we have one last question, and then we'll break for tea and stuff outside. Yeah.
Debate that is going on in the entertainment industry. For example, people are saying that the quality of music and that of TV shows, Hindi TV series especially, have gone down. So would you say that we can say the same of journalism and place it in a larger sociological debate? Or do we just need some kind of an act like the Whistleblowers Protection Act that would help increase the quality of journalism?
That's an intriguing thought, but I don't want you to leave this talk with the impression that
the quality of journalism has declined. That's not at all what I'm saying. I would say the quality of the media industry has declined. The quality of television channels and newspapers has declined. But we are doing Indian journalists are doing better journalism today than they were at any time in the past. This is not a negative comment on journalists from the past, but today the kind of stories that do manage to get covered, they may not be covered in the mainstream or the big press, they may not make it to national television, but they are covered. You have a huge ecosystem of freelance reporters, so that we are getting stories from places in India that were perhaps never written about in the past. And we're getting video footage of, we are getting, so I would say that the fact that a video of that horrible, Riyasi incident, I don't know, all of you must have seen that video of these crazed people shouting Bharat Mata Ki Jai and Jai Shri Ram and trying to murder 3 women in the name of so-called cow protection. Jammu region, but Riyasi district. This is, so the technology of today allows that horrible scene to be captured, allows it to be disseminated, it allows us, somebody like us, to put it in the form of a structured video that is then seen by tens of thousands of, if not millions of people. And there are lots of stories like this that are being told, that by journalists, not all of whom are professional journalists. But so I would say that quality journalism is excellent. I would say the quality of movie making, I'm less qualified to comment on that, but in some ways, I'm not as, you have a lot of crap that's made, a lot of dross, but you have very interesting filmmaking going on, some quite interesting music also happening, but this is not the mainstream, right? It's not the dominant. The dominant will always be what is most commercially, where the greatest money is riding, where the, which is, so I would say, in some ways the media reflects what is happening in the news media is reflecting what is happening elsewhere in other forms of visual communication or audiovisual communication, where you have a lot of good stuff but which is drowned out by the dross which is mass produced and that is commercially viable. And there's always a fight or a struggle between for quality, and eventually it's not always quality that wins. It's what the market, it's what the deepest pockets, or those things on which the greatest money is riding, that that at the end of the day triumph. And this is also a highly subjective thing. I have not seen Bahubali 1 and I don't plan to see Bahubali 2, but I wouldn't really argue with people who say that these are that they hit the right spot when you go to a cinema hall just to get entertained. So I would say that these sort of in the realm of subjectivity to a certain extent when it comes to music and cinema. But I would say when it comes to journalism, I don't think that I think we have a lot of high quality journalism more than ever before.
Right, let's stop here and Carrie, there's tea outside. Thank you very much for coming and for what is a wonderful talk. This is from Jindal.
Okay.
And this is.
Right. All right. Thank you.
You're supposed to put it on.
This is like some kind of woolly thing.
It's a scarf.
I'm not sure what. You can hand it over.